My name is Samuel Whitaker. I am 76 years old, and I live alone in a creaking farmhouse that sits on the edge of a forgotten road in Kansas, surrounded by cornfields that once seemed endless and proud, but now feel more like a prison wall. I have been retired for more than a decade, and though my hands still remember the rhythm of carpentry and the precise measurements of a builder's craft, my days have long ceased to carry the satisfaction of labor. After my wife Margaret passed away 7 years ago, my home grew silent, as if every wall swallowed its own echoes. The only voice that remained faithful to me was the one that came from the worn pages of my Bible, a heavy black-covered book that Margaret had given me on our 10th wedding anniversary. Over time, it had turned into more than just a book. It became a diary of my faith, a place where every margin carried a note about a passage that had struck my heart. Every crease in the page, a reminder of evenings when we read aloud together, her gentle voice smoothing the sharp edges of Scripture with the warmth of her presence. The Bible had grown worn and fragile, but it was as if it carried within its pages the essence of our life together. The prayers for our children written in faded blue ink, the pressed lilac petals she had once tucked into the Psalms, and the little smudges of flour where she had read to me while baking bread. I am not a man of many hobbies. My world became small when Margaret died, and though I tried to fill it with small rituals, coffee at sunrise, a short walk to the edge of the field, a slow read of the newspaper, it always circled back to the one ritual that anchored me, the reading of the Bible. Some men lean on television or on the company of neighbors, but I leaned on Scripture and the presence of God as if it were the last rope keeping me from falling into an abyss of loneliness. My children often told me that I was old-fashioned, that no one really read the Bible anymore except for church services, but I never argued back. I simply smiled because I knew they could not understand what it meant for me to sit with that book and hear, in the whisper of its pages, the voice of a woman I had loved for more than 50 years. It is difficult to explain what happens to a man when he loses his partner after half a century of companionship. At first, the silence feels like a cruel joke, like she has just stepped out of the kitchen and will return at any moment with a warm plate of biscuits. You keep looking for her shadow in the hallway, her slippers under the bed, the faint humming she used to make when she watered the plants. But after months pass and the silence does not break, you begin to understand that the house is not waiting for her anymore. It has surrendered her absence and begun to calcify around you, making every chair feel colder, every room more foreign. And so I carried my Bible everywhere, not just as a symbol of faith, but as a shield against despair. When the nights were long and insomnia made the darkness unbearable, I would rest the book against my chest and feel its weight like a heartbeat, reminding me that I was not entirely abandoned. I raised 2 children with Margaret, my son Jonathan and my daughter Elise. They both grew into successful adults, proud of their modern lives in the city, full of schedules, business dinners, and travel plans. They speak about investments and careers in the same breathless way that Margaret once spoke about gardening. And though I try to listen with interest, I often feel like a relic, like an old piece of furniture they don't quite know what to do with, but are too ashamed to throw away. I remember when they were small, when Elise used to climb into Margaret's lap and ask for another bedtime psalm, and when Jonathan once whispered that he wanted to be a preacher because he liked the sound of the hymns on Sunday morning. How easily children forget the words they once spoke with the sincerity of angels. Now they tell me, with the same conviction, that faith is a crutch, that I should stop wasting my time with those old stories. I do not argue, not because I agree, but because I know there is no bridge that can span the distance between their world and mine. I carry my faith quietly, and I try to believe that someday they will understand, though every year it feels less and less likely. There are days when I feel the world outside has already buried me, though I still breathe. The neighbors who once waved as they drove by have long since moved away or passed on, and the new families who rent the land rarely stop to say hello. My body is slower now, and though I can still walk the fields, every step feels heavier than it used to. Yet even in my frailty, I have always found strength in Scripture. I never read it as a list of rules, but as a companion, a mirror that reminded me of endurance, forgiveness, and hope. Margaret often said that as long as I had that Bible, I would never truly be alone. And she was right. When I sat at the kitchen table and read aloud to no one but the empty chairs, I sometimes swore I could hear her voice finishing the verses with me. Still, loneliness has a way of grinding down even the strongest stones, and in my weaker moments, I long for my children's warmth, for my grandchildren's laughter echoing through the halls. I try to reach out, I call, I invite them to visit, but more often than not, the visits feel obligatory, rushed, as if they are ticking off a box on their list of duties. I have learned to accept the polite smiles, the distracted glances at their phones, the way they exchange looks when I bow my head in prayer before a meal. They do not openly mock me in those moments, but the air is heavy with their unspoken impatience. I can see it in their eyes. They think the old man is clinging to something unnecessary, something embarrassing. And though I swallow my pride and pretend not to notice, every time I feel a little piece of my heart break. What hurts most is not the mockery itself, but the distance it represents. My children did not grow up this way. They were raised on hymns and grace before supper, on Sunday mornings that began with church bells. Somewhere along the way, the world convinced them that those things were childish, and I became, in their eyes, a man who had refused to grow up. They talk about progress and science as though it is a new religion, and I sit quietly because I know that if I protest, they will only laugh. I am not afraid of their laughter. I have lived long enough to endure worse, but I am afraid of what it says about the bond between us, how fragile and thin it has become. There is a photograph that hangs in my living room, one that Margaret loved. The four of us gathered around the Christmas tree. Jonathan only 10, Elise barely 7, both of them clutching new children's Bibles that we had given them as gifts. Margaret is smiling at the camera with such joy that even now it makes my chest ache to look at it. That photo reminds me that once, not so long ago, we were united in faith and love. But when I look at it now, it feels like a portrait of strangers, like a dream that belonged to another lifetime. I wonder if my children ever think of those days, or if they have erased them completely, the way one deletes a file from a computer. I wonder if they even remember Margaret's voice reading to them, the same way she read to me. And so, my introduction is simple. I am an old man who has lived through work and loss, who has given his life to his family and to his faith, and who finds himself, in the twilight of his years, holding tightly to the one thing that has never betrayed him. The Bible Margaret pressed into my hands decades ago. To anyone else it may look like a brittle book with cracked leather and yellowed pages, but to me it is the last piece of my wife's soul, the vessel of my endurance, the anchor of my sanity. Every morning I open it with reverence, and every evening I close it with gratitude, whispering a prayer into the silence of my house, hoping it reaches Margaret wherever she is. If there is one truth I still carry with certainty, it is this. The world may strip away dignity, companionship, even respect, but as long as I have that book and the faith it represents, I will not be abandoned. It was in the spring, when the fields had just begun to stretch green across the horizon, and the air carried the scent of damp earth, that my son Jonathan called to say he and his family were coming for a visit. His voice on the phone was brisk, almost impatient, as if he were squeezing me into a schedule already packed with obligations. But I received the news with the same foolish hope I always did, imagining laughter in the empty rooms, children's footsteps on the wooden stairs, and perhaps even a shared meal where grace was said without hesitation. In the days that followed, I prepared the house as best I could, though there was little to polish in a place worn by time, and I took the Bible from its shelf and placed it on the dining table where Margaret used to set her floral centerpieces, thinking it might spark a memory in them, a thread that would connect the present moment to the tenderness of the past. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, the driveway filling with the sound of tires crunching gravel, and I stood on the porch waiting, my heart leaping at the sight of my grandchildren stepping out of the car, taller and more grown than the last time I saw them. For a fleeting moment, I believed that time might bend backward, that the old bond could be renewed. Yet the first words out of Jonathan's mouth were not warm greetings, but a practical remark about the state of the house, how it looked like I had let the paint fade and the porch sag. I smiled faintly, refusing to let the sting take root, and opened my arms to embrace him, though he returned it with only a quick pat on the shoulder, his eyes already scanning his phone. Elise had not come, busy with her own affairs, so it was Jonathan, his wife Marlene, and their two sons, Lucas and Aaron. Inside the house the atmosphere was restless, as though the air itself resisted being filled with their hurried voices. Marlene commented on the outdated furniture, the old smell of books, and the lack of a television in the living room, as if she had entered a museum rather than her husband's childhood home. The boys wandered about with the restless energy of youth, touching shelves, opening drawers, and laughing at the dusty relics of a life they did not understand. When Lucas stumbled upon the Bible resting on the table, he lifted it with exaggerated effort, exclaiming how heavy it was, and Aaron laughed, flipping through the pages as though it were a curiosity from another era. I asked them gently to be careful, explaining that it was not just any book, but a gift from their grandmother, filled with her handwriting and my notes, a sacred witness to our lives. They looked at me with smirks that carried no malice but the casual cruelty of ignorance, and Jonathan chuckled, saying, "Dad, don't burden them with all that old superstition. It's just paper." Those words pierced me deeper than I expected, not because I had never heard them before, but because they were spoken in the very home where Margaret and I had built a life on faith. I wanted to argue, to remind him that every note in that Bible represented nights when we prayed for him, for Elise, for their safety and their future. But instead, I swallowed my reply and let silence settle between us. Later, at dinner, when I bowed my head to pray, Jonathan cleared his throat loudly, and Marlene rolled her eyes, and the boys snickered into their napkins. I carried on with the blessing anyway, my voice trembling but firm, because I refused to let their impatience rob me of that moment. After supper, while the dishes clattered in the sink, Jonathan pulled me aside and said, "Dad, you've got to stop living like this. The Bible, the prayers, all of it. It makes you look weak. The kids don't need to see you clinging to fairy tales. They need to see strength, modern thinking, not this outdated devotion." I stared at him, remembering the boy who once asked me to read him stories about David and Goliath, who used to sit cross-legged at Margaret's feet during Sunday school lessons. Now his voice was hard, practical, devoid of reverence. I told him quietly that strength is not the absence of faith, but the endurance of it, that without faith I would not have survived losing Margaret, nor the long years of solitude. He shook his head, muttering that I was impossible, that I was stuck in the past. That night, as they settled into the guest rooms, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the Bible, running my fingers across its scarred cover. I felt a tremor of fear, a realization that something fragile was being tested, that the very bond between us was being strained by their disdain for the one thing that had kept me alive. Yet I clung to hope. I told myself that perhaps tomorrow would be better, that perhaps the boys would ask about their grandmother, that Jonathan would soften if I told him how much Margaret had prayed for his happiness. But deep inside, I sensed the beginning of a storm, a conflict that had been brewing for years, but had never found its spark. The catalyst was not a single moment, but a series of small wounds, each delivered casually, each brushing against the same raw nerve. When Aaron laughed at a verse I read aloud, calling it nonsense, Jonathan did not correct him, but smiled as though amused. When Marlene complained that my faith was suffocating, saying she didn't want her children exposed to old guilt and dogma, Jonathan nodded in agreement. And when I asked them to join me on Sunday at the small chapel down the road, they refused, saying they didn't have time for rituals that meant nothing to them. What they did not see was that their rejection was not just of my beliefs, but of me, of Margaret, of the very foundation of our family. They treated my Bible as a relic, a burden, a thing to be mocked, and in doing so they tore at the last thread connecting them to their own history. I wanted to tell them that faith was not a cage, but a shelter, that it was the only thing that had preserved my dignity in the face of abandonment. But I knew my words would fall on ears too, deafened by modern noise to listen. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint murmur of their voices in the other rooms, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. Something was coming, something darker than mere disagreement. They had touched the Bible with careless hands, and in their laughter I had heard not only dismissal, but a dangerous contempt. I prayed silently, asking God to give me patience, to give me the strength not to lash out in anger, but also to prepare me for the pain I knew was approaching. It was in that prayer, whispered into the emptiness of the farmhouse, that I realized the visit was not a reunion, but a test, one that would strip away every illusion I still held about family and loyalty. The following day began with a strained kind of quiet, the sort of silence that hums beneath the surface of polite conversation, when everyone is careful to avoid the topics that had already drawn sparks. Yet all the while, every word and gesture is weighted with what has been left unsaid. I rose before the others, as I always do, made coffee in the percolator that Margaret had insisted on keeping, even after the children bought us a newer machine, and I opened my Bible at the kitchen table, letting the early light spill across its pages. The smell of coffee and the rhythm of the scripture were always enough to steady me. Yet that morning the calm was fragile, like glass resting on the edge of a table. When Lucas wandered in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he caught sight of me reading and muttered, with that careless cruelty of youth, "Grandpa, are you still reading that thing? Don't you know it's all made up?" He said it not as a serious question, but as a joke, something he had likely heard from his parents. And before I could respond, Aaron stumbled in and echoed his brother with a laugh. I closed the Bible quietly, unwilling to let my temper rise so early in the day. But the sting of their words lingered long after they had gone to raid the pantry for cereal. When Jonathan appeared, he made no comment about the boy's behavior, only reminded me that we would all be driving into town later for lunch. I wanted to ask him why he let his children speak with such disrespect, but his face was closed, already half turned toward his phone, and I knew the question would bounce off him like a pebble against stone. Marlene arrived last, perfectly dressed as if even a casual meal in town required her to present herself like an advertisement, and she wrinkled her nose at the open Bible on the table, asking if I had to keep it out all the time, as though its presence alone was an inconvenience. I placed it back on the shelf in the living room, though it felt like I was putting away not just a book, but a part of myself, retreating so as not to provoke their scorn. The tension only thickened as the hours passed. In town, they hurried through the diner menu, impatient with the slow service, while I sat quietly, content to wait. Jonathan spoke loudly about his business, about contracts and numbers, while his children fiddled with their phones, showing each other videos that made them laugh with the reckless volume of those who feel entitled to any space they occupy. I wanted to speak, to tell them about the way the town had changed since Margaret and I used to come here for Sunday pie, to share stories that might root them in a history they seemed determined to ignore. But every time I opened my mouth, someone interrupted as though my words were too slow, too irrelevant to wait for. I fell silent again, staring at the coffee that had grown cold in front of me, and tried not to let the bitterness eat at me. That evening, back at the farmhouse, the unease turned sharper. The boys discovered the box of Margaret's old hymnals in the attic, and instead of treating them with reverence, they brought them down as curiosities, leafing through the fragile pages and imitating the solemn voices of preachers they had seen on television, their parody dripping with mockery. Jonathan chuckled, telling them not to damage anything, but there was no correction, no sense that he understood the cruelty of what they were doing. I asked them gently to return the books to where they found them, explaining that their grandmother had treasured them, but Lucas laughed and said, "Grandma's gone, Grandpa, and these songs are gone too." My hands trembled as I reached out to take the hymnals, but Jonathan stopped me with a sharp look, telling me I was overreacting, that they were just children having fun. That night the breaking point came closer, though it did not yet arrive. As we sat in the living room, I asked if they would join me in reading a psalm before bed, a tradition Margaret had kept alive in our family for decades. Jonathan sighed heavily, Marlene said it was late, and the boys exchanged mocking glances, whispering to each other. When I persisted, opening the Bible and reading aloud regardless of their reluctance, Aaron interrupted with laughter, imitating the cadence of my voice, turning sacred words into a caricature. The others joined in, Marlene covering her mouth with a smirk, Jonathan shaking his head as though embarrassed for me rather than for his son. I stopped reading, my voice faltering, and closed the Bible with hands that trembled more from sorrow than age. The humiliation was sharp, not because they had mocked me, but because in mocking me they had mocked Margaret, mocked every prayer she had whispered for them, mocked the very love that had raised them. I retreated to my room, unable to sit in their company any longer. But even behind the closed door, I could hear their laughter drifting through the hallway, each peal a reminder that my faith, the foundation of my life, had become entertainment for those I loved most. I sat on the edge of the bed, the Bible in my lap, and for the first time in many years I felt a wave of doubt, not in God, but in the strength of family. I wondered whether Margaret, from wherever she now watched, could see what had become of her children and grandchildren, and whether she wept at the sight of their scorn. I prayed for calm, but my chest ached as though the prayer could not rise beyond the ceiling. The next morning confirmed what I had feared. When I entered the kitchen, the Bible was no longer on the shelf. Panic surged in me until I found it lying on the counter, but its pages were bent as if it had been handled carelessly, and one of Margaret's notes, a fragile scrap of paper in her handwriting, had fallen to the floor and been crumpled beneath someone's shoe. I picked it up, smoothing it with trembling fingers, and asked the boys if they had touched the book. Lucas smirked and said he had only wanted to see what was inside, that it was funny to read all the underlined verses and the scribbled prayers. Jonathan, standing by the sink, said nothing, only shrugged and muttered that I shouldn't leave things out if I didn't want them touched. The dismissal was so casual that it cut deeper than any argument. For the rest of their visit, I felt myself shrinking, as though every act of faith, every gesture of devotion, was something shameful, something to be hidden from the very people who should have cherished it most. The farmhouse no longer felt like my home, but like a stage where I was cast as the fool, the relic, the stubborn old man who refused to surrender his illusions. Yet even as they pushed me into silence, I felt a fire building beneath the humiliation, a certainty that their laughter was not harmless, that it would lead to something darker, something that would force me to confront them in a way I had long tried to avoid, and in that slow-burning fire, the escalation began. The line between faith and family fraying until I could no longer pretend that both could exist in harmony under the same roof. The breaking point arrived on the third evening of their visit, and though in hindsight I can say that I should have seen it coming, in the moment it felt like a sudden collapse, as if a storm had been gathering for years in the distance, and now descended all at once, drenching every corner of my home with its cruelty. It began with a simple dinner, the kind Margaret and I had hosted countless times, though this time I felt like an intruder in my own kitchen. I roasted a chicken, mashed potatoes, and baked a pie, wanting to offer them the kind of meal that had once brought us all together. But from the start there was impatience in the air. Marlene complained about the lack of wine. Jonathan scrolled through his phone, even as we sat at the table, and the boys made faces at the food, saying they preferred takeout. I tried to push past the irritation, telling myself that once we had eaten and settled, perhaps the mood would soften. Perhaps I could share with them a passage that Margaret had once marked, a prayer she had written for the family, something that might remind them of what bound us together. After the plates were cleared and the boys lingered in the living room, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and, almost as if to provoke me, said that religion was the reason people never moved forward, that it was a chain dragging humanity back. Marlene chimed in, saying that clinging to faith was the same as clinging to fairy tales, that one day their children would look back and laugh at how people once believed such things. I wanted to respond with patience, to explain that faith was not an obstacle, but a compass. But before I could gather my words, Lucas came into the dining room, holding the Bible, my Bible, Margaret's Bible, cradled in his arms, not with reverence, but with the mischievous grin of a boy who knew he was about to cause trouble. Aaron followed him, and between them they began to flip the pages, reading aloud the verses with exaggerated voices, imitating the solemn tone of preachers, their mockery filling the house with a sound that made my chest tighten as if a vice were clamped around my heart. I stood, reaching out to take the book, but Jonathan blocked me with a dismissive gesture, telling me to let them have their fun, that maybe it was good for them to see how ridiculous those stories sounded. My voice trembled as I said that the book was sacred, that their grandmother's handwriting was in those pages, that they should treat it with care. But the boys only laughed harder, and Marlene smirked, leaning back as though enjoying a performance, staged for her amusement. My hands shook as I pleaded with them to give it back, my voice rising despite myself. And then, in a moment that felt like a knife sliding deep into my soul, Aaron held the Bible open above the fireplace, the flames from the evening fire already crackling, and Lucas egged him on with laughter. I moved toward them, my body slow, my knees aching, but my desperation strong enough to propel me forward. I begged them. I told them that it was not just a book, that it was Margaret's memory, that it was the only piece of her voice I had left. But Jonathan, my own son, stood there and said, "Dad, it's time you let go of the past. You can't keep living in the shadow of a dead woman. This isn't helping you. Maybe it's better if the boys burn it. Maybe then you'll finally move on." His words froze me in place. The firelight flickered across his face, and for a moment he looked like a stranger, not the boy I had raised, not the man Margaret had prayed for. And then it happened. Aaron dropped the Bible into the fire. The flames seized it eagerly, curling the pages, blackening the edges, consuming not only the words, but the notes, the pressed flowers, the fingerprints of Margaret's hands. Lucas clapped as though it were a show, and Marlene laughed, her voice high and sharp, while Jonathan shook his head with a half-smile, saying it was for the best. I felt my knees weaken, and I stumbled to the hearth, reaching out with trembling hands as if I could snatch it back from the flames. But Jonathan caught my arm, holding me in place, telling me to stop embarrassing myself. The heat seared my face. The acrid smoke burned my eyes. And I watched as the last tangible piece of Margaret, the vessel of our shared faith, turned to ash before my eyes. I cannot describe the hollowness that filled me in that moment. It was not anger, not yet, though rage trembled deep within me like a storm waiting to break. It was grief, raw and absolute, as though Margaret had died all over again. This time not by nature's hand, but by the deliberate cruelty of those she had once loved. I sank into the nearest chair, my body trembling, my breath shallow, and for a long while I could not speak. The boys laughed nervously, their amusement dimming as they saw my silence, and Marlene shifted uncomfortably, but Jonathan remained firm, saying that I would thank him someday, that I needed to stop clinging to symbols, but he did not understand. None of them understood. It was not a symbol that had been burned. It was my wife's voice, her handwriting, her prayers, her very presence. And in their laughter I heard the sound of betrayal so deep that it fractured something inside me beyond repair. I said nothing, because I knew that if I spoke, my voice would break, and I would beg, and I refused to beg those who had just desecrated the most sacred part of my life. Instead, I sat in silence, the smoke curling around me like a shroud, my heart beating slowly as though weighed down with stones. And I felt the world tilt, the line between father and son, between love and cruelty, forever broken. That was the moment I knew things would never return to what they had been. The fire had not only consumed the Bible, but had burned away the last illusion that my family might one day understand me, might one day come back to the faith that had once bound us. The midpoint of this story was not only the destruction of an object, but the destruction of trust. And as I sat there, staring into the flames that now held nothing but ash, I felt the first stirrings of something stronger than grief, something that would guide me in the days to come. The quiet certainty that God sees everything, and that those who mock what is sacred will one day face a fire far greater than the one in my hearth. In the gray hush of the morning after the fire, the house smelled faintly of char and damp ash. A thin, bitter veil that clung to the curtains and to my clothes, as if the air itself wanted to remind me, with every breath, of what had been taken. And, while the others moved about with forced normalcy, Marlene running water as if she intended to purge the kitchen of its history, the boys slinging their backpacks over one shoulder in the theatrical way of adolescence, Jonathan's voice clipped as he fielded calls and sent terse emails. I sat at the table with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, feeling the tremor in my fingertips settle into something steadier and more dangerous than grief. When Jonathan finally closed his laptop and took the chair across from me, there was a strange brightness in his eyes, the glitter of a man who has convinced himself that cruelty can be repackaged as compassion if only one chooses the right words. And he began to speak with that gentle, managerial tone that he used on employees and contractors, explaining that last night had been dramatic but necessary, that symbols had power and sometimes a man must be shocked free of them, and that, moving forward, we needed to put certain structures in place so there would be no more scenes, by which he meant he had arranged for a notary to stop by in the afternoon, so I could sign a durable power of attorney, medical and financial, very standard and sensible, nothing to fear, a responsible son's way of making sure bills were paid on time and appointments were kept, and no spiritual distractions got in the way of practical life. I listened without interrupting, marveling at how he had folded last night's desecration into a case study on elder care. And when he paused for my assent, I told him with a quietness that startled even me that I would not sign anything today or any day. that I still knew my name and my history and my God, and that a home where a man's Bible could be thrown into the fire with laughter was not a home where a man should hand over his signature to the ones who struck the match. He smiled then, the way a salesman smiles when a client resists the first pitch, and shifted to the second layer of the plan, saying there was an opening at a place called Meadowbrook just outside town. Bright rooms and 3 hot meals and a shuttle to the mall, a book club if I insisted on reading, a visiting clinician twice a week, and a quiet church service on Sundays that was interfaith and non-judgmental, which he offered as if it were an improvement on the stubborn fidelity of the chapel down the road. He spoke about safety and about the burden of country living, about icy steps and old wiring and the loneliness of long winters. And while he talked, Marlene drifted into the doorway and stood there with her arms folded, letting him play the benevolent son while she surveyed the kitchen like a foreman evaluating a building slated for teardown. And when he finished, she added the finishing nail, that the boys were unsettled by my intensity, that faith had become performative and destabilizing in the household, and that the healthiest thing for everyone would be a move, not as punishment, but as a gift, a soft landing for a man who had clearly reached the stage where sentiment made him volatile. I felt, as she spoke, the oddest sensation of standing at a well I had known my whole life and watching them pour dye into it, turning the water unfamiliar so that when I lifted the bucket, I could no longer recognize what I had relied on. And I told them that mockery cannot be laundered by the language of wellness, that a dignified old age is not a privilege granted by children with clipboards, but a right bestowed by a life lived faithfully, and that if they wished to help me, they could begin by apologizing to a woman who was not there to receive it, but who could hear every word. The apology did not come. Instead, the retaliation grew polite, which is a more dangerous form than open anger. And by noon, a white sedan turned into my drive with the county seal on the door, and a neat woman with a lanyard stepped out carrying a tablet, her smile practiced and warm, introducing herself as a caseworker, following up on a call from concerned relatives about a senior living in hazardous conditions, with religious preoccupations that impeded daily functioning. And I understood, in the precise phrasing of her intake questions, how swiftly a story can be flipped on its back and pinned there with official words. I answered her fully, showed her the pantry stocked and the furnace serviced, read to her the Sunday school rosters. From the years when I taught small boys to memorize verses without shame, and when she glanced toward the cold fireplace and asked about the soot and the scorched fragments on the grate, Jonathan spoke up with smooth confidence and said, "We had had an accident last night when I fell asleep with a Bible too close to the embers, a slip of the hand, nothing malicious, just the kind of thing that proves a man needs oversight." I turned my head and looked at him as one looks at a man who has opened a trap door beneath your feet, and I corrected the record with measured clarity, describing exactly what had happened and naming the hands that had dropped the book into the flame. And the caseworker, who had come to inventory hazards, now did the harder work of discerning truth, her eyes moving from my steady gaze to Jonathan's cheerful poise, to Marlene's cool deflection, to the boys hovering in the hallway, shifty and fascinated by the whiff of drama, and she took notes and asked more questions and said she would follow up, which is what one says when one has glimpsed something ugly and knows it will not resolve in a single visit. The afternoon lengthened and the strategies multiplied. Small humiliations that might be dismissed individually as misunderstandings, but that together formed a design. The boys took photographs of the cluttered tool bench in the shed and texted them to Marlene with captions about unsafe hoarder vibes. The smoke detectors, which had beeped intermittently for months because I could not get the ladder to sit right on the uneven floor, were taken down while I was outside and then presented to Obi, caseworker, as evidence of neglect when she returned to speak with the children. My truck keys, which I keep hung on a nail by the back door, went missing for several hours until I found them in the pocket of a jacket I had not worn in years. And Jonathan clucked sympathetically about memory lapses, making a note on his phone as if to capture the data point. At supper, he placed a stack of papers by my plate and asked me to look them over after we ate. Small forms about billing and insurance, just convenient authorizations. But when I glanced through them, I found, folded midway in the stack, like a thorn in a bouquet, a quitclaim deed, transferring the farmhouse and 3 surrounding acres into a trust he controlled, with vague language about tax optimization and care coordination. And I set my fork down and slid the papers back without a word, because I did not trust my voice to carry without breaking. And Marlene sighed, as if weary of a child's stubbornness, while Jonathan said that he hated for this to get formal, but he would do what was necessary to keep me safe. That night sleep did not come, so I walked the house slowly, pausing in the doorway of each room as though I might find Margaret there, hands dusted with flour, humming her small, tuneless hymns, and somewhere between midnight and dawn in that hour, when even grief grows tired, I remembered the old metal lockbox in the cellar, the one I had not opened since the summer after Margaret died. And I fetched the flashlight and went down to the cool, damp space where the walls wept a little after rain. And I pulled out the box and pried it open with a painter's tool. And inside I found the paper trail of the life we had built carefully and without spectacle. The deed to the farm, with Margaret's maiden name still neatly printed below mine. The insurance policy I thought I had lost. A letter from our pastor the year we nearly lost the place to drought and were saved by the congregation's quiet generosity. And beneath those envelopes, wrapped in a handkerchief, I recognized a small stack of Margaret's notes I had never read, the letters she wrote in the last months when the pain woke her before dawn. Words for me to find when I was ready. I took them upstairs and read them at the kitchen table as the sun made a pale ribbon on the eastern horizon. And in one letter she wrote that fear makes people cold and proud and quick to torch what they do not understand, but that love is stubborn and will outlast their fires. And in another she told me not to surrender the house to anyone who spoke of safety while treating the sacred as clutter. And in the last, the one dated 3 days before she left me, she said that if the children ever turned practical in the way of the world, I was to stand my ground calmly and let God do the burning that refines, rather than the burning that destroys. For the Lord sorts the fires as surely as farmers sort the wheat. Armed with her handwriting, which felt like a benediction pressed into my palm, I made practical moves in the morning that must have startled them, because they had expected me to flail, not to act. I called Pastor Ben and asked him to come by for coffee, and when he arrived I asked him to witness me placing the deed and the letters and a recorded statement into a fresh lockbox that I then put into the back of his truck for safekeeping at the church. I phoned the bank manager, an old student of mine from a men's Bible study a lifetime ago, and set passwords that neither Jonathan nor Marlene could guess, and I added an alert for any attempts at reverse mortgages or lines of credit secured by property. I asked Earl, my neighbor, whose arthritis keeps him home, but whose grandson is a volunteer firefighter, to come check the wiring in the living room, so that when the county returned, there would be a documented inspection by someone the town trusted. And then, before lunch, I drove into the clerk's office because the keys had, by some miracle of providence, turned up precisely where I had searched for them the night before, and filed a simple affidavit stating that any conveyance of the homestead made without independent counsel and a cooling-off period should be treated as presumptively coerced, not because such a document has the power to stop the unscrupulous, but because paper trails shape how strangers hear a story, and I needed strangers should it come to that. To hear mine, these steps, infuriating in their quiet competence, provoked a new phase of the assault, not with overt violence, but with the ruinous tools of modern life. That afternoon my landline went dead, and the internet flickered off. And when I called the provider from my cell phone, they told me the account holder, a name I did not recognize, but which after a brief search turned out to be a management company with which Jonathan did business, had requested a service suspension for a property undergoing transition, a phrase as bloodless as a scalpel. The heating oil delivery, which I had scheduled for the end of the week, was canceled at the resident's request, and only the kindness of the driver who knew my routine kept him from turning the truck around. And when the mail arrived, a thick envelope bore a form letter from an elder law firm I had never contacted, congratulating me on my wise decision to consolidate my legal affairs under their guidance and listing, in careful type the documents I was purportedly preparing to sign. When I confronted Jonathan with the stack, no shouting, only the simple placement of the evidence between us on the table, he did not blush or break. He only widened his hands and said that in any enterprise there are administrative snarls, that we had gotten wires crossed, that he had tried to get ahead of the paperwork to ease the burden, and that I should be grateful to a son who took days off work to ensure his father did not die in a house full of books and ash. I saw then, with the clarity that comes only after a man has been stripped of illusion, that my son's compassion was a garment he wore for the neighbors, while underneath it his skin had grown hungry with a fear that had nothing to do with me. The fear of debt from a business bleeding cash, the fear of status slipping in a world that counts only what can be priced, the fear that the old homestead, sitting on an attractive slice of land 5 miles from a highway exit, represented liquidity if only the stubborn old man could be persuaded to surrender. And this fear had recruited my faith as an alibi, so that the destruction of a Bible could be reframed as an intervention rather than a theft. That night after they had gone to bed, my cell phone buzzed with a text from Elise, my daughter who had stayed away from the visit, and her message, hesitant and painful, told me that Jonathan had asked her months ago to sign off on a family trust for tax purposes, that he had mentioned investors and personal guarantees, that he had said the land was otherwise going to waste, and that she had refused because even in her distance from the church she knew our mother's wishes, and she begged me to be careful because the tone in Jonathan's voice scared her, the way a good man sounds when he has convinced himself that the only way out is through someone else's door. The second escalation did not end with a single blow, but with a series of deliberate small devastations that, added together, felt like a siege. The boys, coached or merely emboldened, staged photographs of me looking confused by turning lights on, and often asking me, rapid fire, to identify which switch belonged to which room, recording my hesitation and sending the clips to their parents' shared folder as documentation. Marlene organized the pantry into neat rows and then, while I was chopping vegetables, accused me of misplacing labels and creating hazards, an accusation she repeated in a follow-up email to the caseworker. A neighbor, persuaded by a story I will never hear in its exact telling, called to say that she had heard I was moving and could she bring over some boxes. Her voice bright and brittle the way voices get when people choose a fiction, because it is cleaner than the truth. I bore it as a man bears sleet under a wool coat, miserably but with a set jaw. And when the caseworker returned, as she had promised, I met her on the porch with photographs of the wiring inspection, the affidavit receipt from the clerk, the bank, manager's letter confirming new safeguards, and Margaret's letters, which I did not show her, but which I carried in my pocket for spine. And I told her calmly that safety and control are not synonyms, that piety and confusion are not interchangeable diagnoses, and that if the county wished to know whether I could care for myself, they were welcome to test me, not with gotcha games about light switches, but with the practical demands of living: bills paid, roof sound, neighbors known, hospitality offered, faith kept without spectacle and without apology. She listened, and this time when she left she said not, "I'll follow up," but "I hear you," which is the first crack in a wall when a bulldozer is not available. By the time the sun set on the seventh day, the uneasy truce of pretense had collapsed, and the house had become a place of watchfulness where every kindness felt barbed, and every request sounded like the rustle of a net. And yet in that narrowing circle, I felt something widen in me, some old farmer's patience that Margaret had always said would be the last of me to die. A patience that is not passivity, but the careful waiting for the field to dry, before you take the weight of the tractor onto it. And I understood that the fight was no longer about a book turned to ash, or even about acreage measured in lines on a plat map, but about whether a man at the end of his life could still be allowed to name what is holy without being declared a danger to himself. I did not know yet what the final act would require or what it would cost, but I knew the hour was coming when their design would turn back on them as surely as a match burns the fingers of the one who thinks he can control its flame. And I slept at last, not because peace had returned, but because resolve had taken its place and begun its slow, steady work. Sunday arrived with a hard blue sky and a wind that moved through the corn like a low, steady breath, and I woke with the certainty that a line would be drawn before nightfall, not by lawyers' forms or whispered threats, but by something older and cleaner than paperwork. So I brewed coffee and set folding chairs in the yard, beneath the hackberry tree where Margaret once tied red ribbons for the grandchildren, and I called Pastor Ben and asked him to bring nothing but his presence. And I phoned Earl to tell him I might need his grandson's number if trouble came, and when the county caseworker, Ms. Delgado, texted that she wanted to follow up informally, I told her she was welcome because I intended to read aloud from memory the passages Margaret had written into the margins they burned, and I did not care any more if those who had laughed thought me theatrical, since grief has its own stage, whether we build it or not. By mid-morning a few neighbors had wandered in with cautious faces and casseroles they pretended were for after church, and Pastor Ben stood with his hands folded, and Ms. Delgado parked by the ditch and came up the drive alone, her lanyard turned backward as if for the hour she wished to be simply a witness. And then Jonathan's SUV rolled in with a flourish as if he were still playing host. Marlene straight back. Beside him, the boys in the rear already glancing down at their phones, and he stepped out carrying a leather portfolio that he kept angled so I could see the edge of a thick sheaf of papers and the gleam of a pen tucked into the clasp. And he smiled, the way men smile when they are about to deliver what they think is a merciful ultimatum. I welcomed them all with the same words, invited everyone to sit, and told Jonathan there would be time enough for business after I had finished saying what needed saying, and when he rolled his eyes toward Marlene, she touched his wrist and told him to let the old man have his moment because it would make the later conversation smoother. And so, in a circle of people who had known our family since before the children were born, I began to speak Margaret's words from memory, not as performance, but as invocation, Psalm answers to the ache that has no name. The Beatitudes that sound like soft hammers shaping a life into something steady. And a few verses she had underlined so many times the paper went thin. And as I spoke, I watched the faces, some wet, some skeptical, some merely still. And I saw Ms. Delgado's gaze softened in that careful way of professionals who are trained not to take sides and yet cannot help being moved when something honest is laid in front of them without malice. When I finished, there was a quiet that did not beg to be broken, and into that quiet Jonathan stepped with his portfolio as if entering an empty room, thanking me for sharing and immediately pivoting, saying that the events of the week had made it clear to everyone that a structured plan was necessary, that for my health and legal protection we should execute the trust and the powers of attorney he had prepared, that a notary was on standby in town, and that after a brief discussion he would arrange for movers to take a few essentials to Meadowbrook while the house underwent a phased transition. And he used those last words with a blandness that made Pastor Ben close his eyes as if to keep from speaking. And I replied that no transition of any phase would occur today or any day under threat, that the land would not be moved by people who called prayer a hazard, and that if he wished to remain my son, he could begin by saying aloud, here where friends could hear him, what he had done, to the book his mother gave me, and he stiffened at that and tried to wave it away as an emotional conflation. But just then Lucas, who had grown restless, whispered to Aaron, and the two of them drifted toward the open barn doors, with the furtive light of boys inventing mischief, phones already raised as if life did not happen unless a lens caught it. At first I thought nothing of it, because half my life had unfolded with grandchildren playing among tractors and hay bales without incident. But a minute later I smelled something that did not belong in a spring yard, the sweet sour start of straw taking flame, and before anyone else registered it, I was already moving, my body remembering distances it had not covered in years, crossing the gravel and calling the boys by name in the same tone I once used in pews, when they squirmed and giggled, and when I reached the threshold I saw them framed by dust motes and smoke, Aaron laughing as he filmed, while Lucas tipped a match into a rusted coffee can stuffed with hay, a stunt for a joke or a dare, and the thin orange tongue had already licked over the rim to the loose straw at their feet, where old oil drips and chaff make a tinder that does not forgive. And in the span of one held breath, the ridiculous became deadly, because fire courts those who think they command it. I bellowed their names, and they startled, Lucas stumbling backward, Aaron still recording, because fear takes a moment to overtake vanity. And I grabbed the old wool blanket from its peg and smothered what I could while shouting to Jonathan for the pump hose rolled by the well. When he froze, I turned to Ms. Delgado and Pastor Ben, and they were already moving, she dialing, he dragging the hose toward me, while Earl came hobbling across the ditch swearing at his knees and yelling for his grandson. And Marlene stood in the yard white-faced and useless, one hand to her mouth and the other hovering over her pocket as if a phone could help her choose which fear to feed. Smoke thickened fast, heavy with the taste of old grease and mouse nests, and the boys lost their bravado and began to cough, their eyes rimmed red and streaming. And I did the stupid and necessary thing an old man does when time is faster than thought. I tied the blanket's fringes around my waist to anchor the wet weight, plunged into the murk to seize Lucas by the sleeve and shove him toward the light, then doubled back for Aaron, who had dropped to one knee like a quarterback protecting a ball, except it was his inhaling lungs he had cupped, and I hauled him up and forward as the first lick became a sheet rolling along the wall toward the rafters where the oldest boards dry like paper. The pump sputtered and spat, then held a thin, steady stream, and I worked it in circles to cut a black edge into the orange. buying minutes, not victory, until sirens grew out of the silence from the road, and the volunteer truck swung wide into the drive. Men in yellow, moving with the choreography of those who have learned how thin the line is between spectacle and mourning. They took over with calm authority, cooling the beams, pulling the boys into air and oxygen and stern questions. And I stepped back then. My palms stung, my lungs raw, and I watched a roof I had patched last summer give up a corner to the flames, before the men beat it down and left the structure standing and scarred. In the churn after the danger had passed, truth began to rise like heat. The deputy who always rides with the volunteers asked who had started it, and the boys hedged until Ms. Delgado said quietly that she had seen the phone screens and that the video would tell what mouths could not. And in a matter of minutes the deputy had the footage in hand, a time-stamped record of their giggling, the match, the tilt, the can, and then, worse for Jonathan than any barn fire, the earlier clip stitched in by the same account. Fragments from the night of the Bible, with captions meant to be funny that looked obscene in daylight and in the faces of neighbors who had sung from those hymnals and eaten from my table. And the murmur that went through the yard then was not the rubbernecking thrill of gossip, but the subdued anger of a town that understands the line between rebellion and cruelty. Jonathan tried to interpose himself, said, "Boys will be boys," and that it was his right as a father to discipline privately and to handle family matters without a crowd. But the deputy said with weary patience that flames and forged papers travel beyond family, and he asked Jonathan to come to the truck to answer a few procedural questions about elder petitions he had filed in the county e-system 3 days earlier. Petitions that had triggered flags at the clerk's office because the notary named had called to report that she had been asked to stamp signatures she had not witnessed, and the clean little machinery of character that had whirred invisibly all week now ground and smoked in public. There is a way a man's face changes when the story he has curated for the world curls under heat. I watched that change pass over my son as Marlene, who had been silent since the smoke began, turned on him not with compassion, but with the fear of a woman who sees the ledger of her life tipping, asking through clenched teeth why he had ever told the boys that there would be no consequences, why he had dared them to prove I was unsafe, why he had convinced himself that filming me would make me small enough to move, and he said her name once as if it could conjure back the cool control they specialized in. But control is a fair-weather friend, and it left them standing in their good shoes on my blackened barn threshold while neighbors who had lent them sugar and jumper cables stared at the ground to spare them a humiliation that had already arrived. Ms. Delgado spoke then, not as a neighbor, but as the county, saying she would be filing a report that afternoon, noting my competence, the manipulations attempted, the environmental hazard introduced by the miners, the potential financial exploitation through unauthorized petitions and trusts. And she said calmly that until a judge reviewed it, she would be recommending a temporary stay on any transfers or changes in my living arrangements, which is the bureaucrat's way of erecting a shield without sounding like a hero. And in her tone, I heard the small, fierce mercy of a stranger who decides to put her name between you and the next blow. In the same moment, because life has a taste for symmetry, Jonathan's phone began to ring with the pinched insistence of a man calls only when money is slipping under a door, and he stepped aside to answer and came back with a grayness around his mouth that had nothing to do with smoke, telling Marlene, in a voice he tried to keep low, that the investors who had promised a bridge loan were pausing pending reputational risk, because a parent on their board had been sent a link to a video of boys burning a Bible, while a grandfather's voice cracked in the background. And while I did not rejoice, I understood. that the match he had used to frighten me into compliance had licked his own future first, because there are some fires the world, even a secular world, still refuses to bless. The deputy finished his notes and told the boys there would be classes and community service, and maybe a charge the prosecutor would decide. And he told Jonathan to expect a summons regarding the petitions, and then he tipped his hat to me and said he was sorry about the barn, that the frame would hold if I wanted to roof it again. And I thanked him and watched the trucks pull away, leaving tracks in the soft ground, like writing that rain will smudge but not erase. When the yard had emptied to a circle of the stubborn, Pastor Ben, Earl on his cane, Ms. Delgado making one last notation, Jonathan stood before me, ash on his sleeve. And for the first time all week, he looked like the boy who once asked why David chose 5 stones when one would do, a boy bewildered by the scale of consequences. And he opened his mouth to say my name, and I held up my hand and told him there would be a time to speak when he could tell the truth without putting varnish on it, and when he had apologized first to God and then to his mother, whose letters I had in my pocket and whose words had steered me through the smoke, and that until that time he and his household were not to step onto this property without Ms. Delgado's notice in writing, which I could now ask for because the county had seen what needed seeing. And he nodded once, small and stiff, and turned away. I did not gloat. I felt only the deep, cooling ache that follows a burn after the nerve ends tire. And I sat on the porch step with a cup of water and watched the wind lift ash in little sighs across the yard, while Pastor Ben went to his truck and returned with a Bible from the church shelf, not to replace what cannot be replaced, but to give my hand something to hold as the day finished what it had started. And I turned it over in my palms, the cover new and too smooth. And I knew the last act would not be vengeance, but the quieter work of staying, of repairing, of remembering aloud in a voice steadier than theirs that some things do not burn, and that the ones who set the fire carry its heat longer than the ones who survived it. In the days after the sirens faded and the barn stood blackened but upright like a soldier who had taken a bullet and refused to fall, the house settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the frightened quiet of a man waiting for the next insult, but the working quiet of recovery where a person speaks less and does more. So I made lists in Margaret's old ledger and worked through them with the steadiness of someone who has learned that healing is just another name for faithful routine. With Earl's cane thumping time in the dust and his grandson handling the ladder, we stripped the scorched rafters and sistered new boards beside the old. We patched the roof with tin until the insurance man came with a check and a smirk of respect, and we cleared a corner of the yard for the volunteer boys to stack lumber, because Ms. Delgado, who had put her name between me and harm when it mattered, arranged community service that was more than punishment. It was instruction, and twice a week Lucas and Aaron arrived late and sullen and left dirty and quiet, and the first time I handed them cold water and said nothing. But the second week, when Aaron paused with his palm on a beam still warm from the sun, he asked me how long a thing can smell like smoke, and I told him as gently as I could that some smells get into the grain and never leave entirely, and that is why a man should be careful what he burns. Word about the petitions and the notary traveled through town without my help, because small places are built for carrying truth the way the prairie carries wind. And Jonathan found doors that had always opened for him now opening only a crack. His bridge of investors washed out by the flood he made with his own hands. And when the clerk filed her report and the prosecutor declined to charge me with incompetence because I was demonstrably not incompetent, there was talk of charges for false filings and of ethics boards and of contracts paused until clarity, a phrase that sounds like mercy until you watch it drain a man's calendar of meetings and a family's account of deposits. The deputy stopped by one afternoon to return a pocket knife. I must have dropped the day of the fire, and he said that the boys would be kept in a diversion program if they kept their grades and kept showing up to rebuild what they almost destroyed. And that seemed right to me, because a young man should be given a chance to learn what a match costs, and an old man should be spared the bitterness of watching a child be ground down into ash. And on Sunday, Pastor Ben brought a long, heavy Bible that smelled of ink and leather and a box of loose archival paper cut to fit in the back, and he asked the congregation to write in the margins. Over the next months, not sermons, but small prayers in their own hands, for this house and for those who had mocked it. And the children wrote first, because children are fearless with pencils. And the old men wrote last, because old men know to choose their words. I did the practical things that keep scavengers away from old wounds. And though I would have preferred not to think of lawyers again, I sat with one anyway and moved the deed into a trust that would leave me a life estate and then, at my death, pass the farm to the little chapel and the volunteer company in equal shares with a note about scholarship stipends for apprentices willing to learn a trade without laughing at the hands that taught them. And I wrote a will that names Jonathan A., beneficiary of nothing more than a photograph of his mother smiling in her Sunday dress, because the part of Margaret he destroyed cannot be replaced with cash, and I refuse to let grief be a ledger. And I sent a copy of those papers to Ms. Delgado because paper trails are the fences of our age. The town did what towns do after a spectacle. It went back to mowing and mail and weather. But I noticed that some people now look me in the eye longer, as if measuring what mercy had cost, and a few left casseroles without names, because it is easier to feed a man than to say you are sorry for not speaking up when it would have been hard. And in the late afternoon, I took to sitting on the step, with the new Bible on my knee, reading aloud the verses that once lived in Margaret's hand, and now live in the hands of many. And I found that the rhythm of other people's ink calmed me, not because it replaced what was lost, but because it refused to let loss have the last word. One evening, while the swallows stitched the sky to the field, Aaron walked up the drive alone, with shoulders slumped in the posture of someone expecting to be sent away. And he asked if he could return the pocket New Testament his grandmother had once given him and that he had kept tucked in his dresser like a guilty secret. And I told him he could keep it if he wanted. And he said that was the problem. He did want. Because when the barn went hot and the room went black, he had thought not of games or jokes, but of the burned book and the sound I made when it went under. And that sound had been following him at night like a stray dog. And I told him that some dogs are angels with their fur on crooked, sent to keep boys from running too far ahead of themselves. And I asked him to help me set a post before he went. And he did. And when he left, he looked back twice, which is how a repentance starts, when a boy doesn't know the word for it. Jonathan did not come, not at first, and when he finally turned into the drive weeks later, it was alone, and he stayed in the car, hands at 10 and 2, and I walked to the window and waited, and he said my name, like a man ashamed to find a mirror in daylight, and he said he had meetings to try to save, and boys to rein back to decency, and a marriage that had turned to glass. And I told him I was not his judge, but I would keep a chair on the porch for the day he came to speak without varnish. And he nodded and went away, and I watched dust rise behind him and refused to hope, because hope is holy and must not be used carelessly. Summer came on soft, and the rebuilt portion of the barn took paint the color of a cloud that has decided not to rain. And on the day the volunteers signed their names on the back side of a beam no one would see, Lucas brought me a folded paper. without looking up, and mumbled that he had copied a psalm for school credit, but had decided to keep it in his wallet instead. And I told him a man should keep a psalm not for credit, but for weather. And he smiled in the unpracticed way of a boy who has learned that not all laughter is cruel. The caseworker's final report came by mail with the cool language of government. But it was warm enough for me. Competent, stable, supported by community. Protective action taken regarding prior attempted exploitation. And though I do not keep trophies, I put that letter in the box with Margaret's new crowd-written margins, because I want anyone who comes after me to see that once there was a fire at this place, and many hands refused to let it spread. In the evenings, I speak to Margaret without embarrassment, telling her how the wind ran a hand through the corn, and how the boys' voices have lost their iron, and how I have chosen to spend what is left of my days in the small, stubborn peace of work and prayer and porch-light hospitality. And I tell her that I no longer wake with a hand at my throat because the house has remembered me, and I have remembered the house. And the Bible that sits here now is heavier than the one they burned, because it carries the weight of a town that decided to write instead of sneer. I do not know whether Jonathan will ever walk up this path without his armor of explanations, or whether Marlene will learn that safety and control are not the same word. But I have learned that a man does not need the repentance of others to keep his own soul clean. He needs only to draw the line where his Lord says to draw it, and then stand there without malice. And so each night I close the book on a scrap of paper where a child has written in crooked letters, "Bless this house," and I lock the door and breathe the deep, clean smell of wood that has known fire and lived. And I lay down without dread, because they thought they burned my Bible and my peace. But the truth is, they set fire to their own comforts. And when their laughter died out, the only flame that remained was the one in my hearth, steady and warm, and mine.